And I think we can get started. Okay. Do you want to take it, Pete, or should I? I don't know if you can hear me. Pete? And now I cannot hear you. Something went wrong. You restarted everything for me.
I can hear you, Francesca, but I can't see you.
Restarting.
But Pete, I can't hear you. I don't know if other people can hear you, Pete.
No, so far we've not been able to hear Pete.
Pete might have lost sound. Let me ping him.
I was able to hear Pete earlier, but he doesn't seem to be talking now. Just looking confused.
I appear to be deaf at the moment.
Very faint.
Now we can hear you. It was a little faint, but
yeah.
We can hear him, but he's probably gonna come back. He looks happy though. That's nice.
You look happy too, but it's only the beginning of the meeting.
Let's wait a little longer and then we'll see. Pete is back. Let's see if he can connect to audio, otherwise I will get started then. Can you hear us now, Pete? Now I can't hear him. I don't know if... Okay, but let's get started. I would like to know if Pete can hear me. Oh, now you can.
I can.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, joy. Okay.
Okay, do you want to take it or should I take the introduction?
I'm happy to do the intros.
Sounds good.
So welcome, everybody. It is Gen Dispatch time. So we will, since we are still early in the week, note well, please be aware that if you are new to the process, or even if you're not new to the process, you should read over the BCPs, which define the processes and policies of the IETF. And if you are participating in this working group, that means that you are agreeing to follow those policies. Please make yourself aware of them. There are lots of them with regard to how we behave in working groups, and there are lots of them with regard to how intellectual property plays in. Please review. So if you don't mind, please have your video off unless you're presenting or speaking, and definitely mute your microphone unless you're speaking. That will help both folks who are listening and keep your bandwidth pretty low. If you can use a headset, please do. That will stop echoes from happening. The blue sheet is automatically generated from the list of folks, so there's no need to write your name down anywhere. We'll check that with the Meet Echo things. And the chat that is taking place over in the chat room on Meet Echo is also taking place on Jabber. You can connect to both and get to the same place. And there are some URLs which you can find to get information on that. If you would download from the agenda page, you'll find most of these links. You'll find this presentation, and it will have all of these links. And so if you need to get to any of these places, those are all the nice URLs. And we'll talk about the incoming and outgoing chairs in a moment, but those are links to email addresses as well. So remember that GenDispatch does not adopt drafts itself. Unlike other dispatch working groups, we only recommend next steps for new work, which means we're either going to recommend directing work to an existing working group, proposing a new focused working group, proposing that an AD sponsor a document if that AD is willing, ask for additional discussion or community development if that's required before making a recommendation, or saying outright that we don't think the IETF should work on a particular topic. Please do keep these outcomes in mind as we have discussion. We're looking for answers to the question of what do we do with these proposals, not necessarily arguing about the contents of the proposals themselves. Those can always change after we decide how to dispatch something. So we will see your name if we're participating in Meet Echo, but for those folks who are only doing audio, please do state your name before you begin speaking. Again, keep the dispatch question in mind. That is the key. So if you're making a comment, always useful to end that comment with, and therefore I think we should do X with the working group or do Y with the document or whatever it is. Please try and keep your comments limited so that everybody gets a chance to speak. The buttons there, if you want to join the queue, just push the little hand button, which is below your name on the left side of the screen. When you are given the floor by the chair, please unmute your audio and unmute your video if you want to show your smiling face so that you can send that. We don't control turning the video on and off, so please do so at your leisure. And then the other controls, that little chatty button is the jabber. If we say that we're going to do a show of hands, up on that top row of buttons, the one that looks like a little bar graph is the show of hands tool, and so we'll ask you to go there. Next. So let's do a little agenda bashing. We've been in the middle of the intro and administrivia, so you don't get to change that. But we have 2 items for the agenda. John Clemson is going to do a quick presentation and discussion on possible futures for RFC 2028. And then Fernando Gant and Keith Moore are going to do a presentation on more general than we've been talking about previously, diversity inclusiveness in the IETF. And then we've got plenty of time to either extend those discussions if they get long, or to do any other business. And then we'll do a quick conclusion. Does anybody have any bashes to the agenda, things they want added, etc.? Listening. John corrects me to say that his is not a presentation, but a rant. That's okay. Okay, so this is our agenda. We will go forward as such. Is that the end of our first round of slides? Is it time for John? And Francesca is clicking around. Good sign.
Can we get my slides up?
All right, you're up to bat, John. I'll mute myself.
Okay, in the process of working on something else, I think the RFC editor issues, I had occasion to look at RFC 2028 for the first time. Next slide, please. In many years, not quite since October 96, but close. This is a quarter century old document, which has substantively, and except for intellectual property rights issues, been unchanged in the last quarter century, except for the IETF LOC terminology. And unsurprisingly, many things have changed in those last 25 years. So the question I want to pose today is a little bit different from the usual one for GenDispatch, and that Pete summarized earlier. There is no draft to replace this at the moment. I'm looking for a sense as to whether there's any way to move forward on this, whether people care, and if the answer to both those questions is yes, then it's the responsibility of either this group or the AD to solicit volunteers and figure out how to move forward. Next slide. So, as I said, in the process of looking at this, I found a number of interesting problems. The document contains normative pointers to things which the authors believed were being worked on at the time. They may have been correct, but those documents have never been completed and published. The document is a particularly interesting comment, still believes the IETF chair is appointed by the IAB, which would make this working group a rather interesting situation. And there may be some IETF LLC loose ends, including things which point to this document and then point elsewhere for details that aren't there. That's also true of a number of other places in this document where it's pointing to things for details which are not there, along with pointing, as I mentioned earlier, documents which don't exist. It claims that the Secretariat, not the LLC, is responsible for maintaining the formal public record of what's going on. That may be true in practice, but whether, given the LLC's organization, that's true in theory is an open question. And again, those are just examples. The document is relative to actual contemporary practice, contemporary organizations, and how things fit together in relatively bad shape. So next slide. I think there is no next slide. Yes. The document predates, as I say, it's old. So it predates the current charter of the Internet Architecture Board, the current charter of the ISG, and all the changes to the RFC editor function and its relationship to the IETF, to say nothing of those changes, which are further changes which are now under discussion. So, as I say, document which is not in good shape, document which we have told other organizations to refer to and try to understand the IETF and what's going on in the IETF. We're probably still telling newcomers that, and it just doesn't reflect contemporary reality. Next slide, if I'm not finished. So, possibilities. One possibility is we've been successfully ignoring this problem for at least 2 decades, and we can continue to do that. Second possibility is to make it historic, erect a tombstone, and tell those who look for it either where to go instead, or they're on their own. Those two options might be equivalent. And then the third possibility, obviously, is to revise and replace the thing. That's probably not a small rewriting task, because some of the things one might replace it with are probably controversial, and there may not be agreement on what to say. Next. That's where I run out. So I didn't need 20 minutes. Back to you, co-chairs, and open for discussion.
Okay, so, well, let's open the floor. And again, please, we're overtly looking to dispatch this thing, so let's talk in those terms. Thoughts? Anybody? Andrew, go right ahead.
Well, firstly, thank you, John, for succinctly setting out the problem, which is really helpful. I'm impressed how quickly you managed to do that. On your three sort of substantive options, I guess I'm struggling to see any viable option other than revise and replace the thing, because it would seem to me to be unacceptable for a standards body to have set some standards of how it behaves that are just plain wrong. I would have thought that undermines the whole premise of everything else the IETF does, dare I say it, if it can't even get its procedures right. And that's not trivializing the task, because it clearly would need people with a lot of detailed historic knowledge of lots of things in order to actually do it. But I think in my view, it's something which now you've identified it and drawn attention to it, it needs to be done. So that's my view. Thank you.
I didn't volunteer among your comments.
Sorry, John, I didn't catch that.
Stephen, I believe you're up next.
Yeah, I put this in general. I'm not clear of the downside of continuing to ignore this. I agree that, from a purist point of view, fixing it will be fine. I think it might be counterproductive, though. So what's the downside of continuing to ignore the problem?
I see the downside as closely connected to what Andrew just said. We're pointing other people to this document. We've got other documents which point to it. We've told other standards bodies in the past that when they are trying to sort out the IAB, IASG, IETF, and ISAC relationships, that this is where they should go look. So there's a little bit of a credibility problem. There's a little bit of an introduction to newcomers problem. And like Andrew, I don't consider those first two options viable, but as I think I told at least Francesca a few days ago, I'm more than happy to try to work with someone or advise someone on writing and editing this, but I don't have time to do it myself.
Since you mentioned it, John, do you want to talk about the downside of making it historic and say we're just not talking about this?
I think it makes us look silly. Maybe we don't care. And in particular, maybe we don't care that anybody to whom we look silly comes to that conclusion. But it strikes me as a little disorderly and unprofessional. But again, since I'm not going to volunteer, my opinion doesn't count very much, and it's a matter of community consensus and whether or not anybody's going to do the work.
Rich, you're up.
John touched on a couple of the downsides. I think having, the DAO, the IETF, which is way too long, but for newcomers to look at, but there are people having run a bunch of the newcomer sessions over the past few years. It'd be really nice to have a short document that says this is how we are structured for newcomers. for people who, and newcomers come from various places. They come as engineers who want to work on things. They come as industry consortia who want to reach out and talk to us, such as, pick a recent one, the Inclusive Naming Initiative. They come to us as, full-fledged heavyweight international standards organizations who want to get liaisons. And we don't have a single clear document that says, here's how it goes. And it's kind of embarrassing to say, oh yeah, it is what it is, ask around, which is really what the only alternative is now.
Does that mean that either Rich or Andrew are volunteering? I guess is always the question.
Sure, I volunteer Andrew. No, I will certainly, yeah, I'll put my hand up because it's got to be done.
All right. Braun, go ahead.
Hopping on exactly the same bandwagon here, that it not only is it really unprofessional, it is really unwelcoming to anyone new coming along to see an organization that that doesn't even know how it works in a defined way. I mean, yes, everybody knows, but everybody knows, and the only way to find out is to ask a bunch of people and build tribal knowledge, build cargo cult your understanding of how it goes, all these terms. That's not the way that any serious organization has its org chart. That is one of the most basic things that you do right at the start, is you say, this is how we are structured, this is how we work. And to be working from a 25-year-old document that's not correct and have that be our normative definition of who we are is pretty bogus. Having said that, I'm not volunteering to write it because I haven't been around long enough. I'm still working on tribal knowledge.
So your recommendation for dispatch is
dispatch the IASG and say, fix this. You're running this organization.
all right. Keith, you're up.
So I think I would say that, to me, I've been looking at this, inclusiveness problem, and this seems like a big part of it, that the organization structure is rather opaque. And not only to newcomers, I've been around over 30 years, and I can't hardly keep track of who's doing what anymore or where to go when I have a certain issue. Having said that, so I think this information needs to be updated in some form. I'm not sure that an RFC is the best way to do it, because RFCs there's so many of them out there, and we don't remember which RFCs do what anymore. It's almost a way of hiding the information. So I think RFCs are good places to put details, so that if you have a lot of details that need to be specified, and someone wants to go read the fine print, sure, point them to an RFC, that's fine. But probably the sort of primary presentation of this should be something attached to the website. And that whole website, I think, needs a whole bunch of thought, because I think the tools are great, but the website is pretty opaque itself. So there's some need to sort of come up with a fresh approach of saying, how do we explain IETF to our participants, and as well as to people who are external, and make that information very clear and accessible.
Okay. Jeffrey.
I think for this document to be useful, it would have to be a living document that kind of is the way that you change the organization, rather than is a documentation of changes that have already been made. Looking at it, it has been updated by kind of references to other RFCs, rather than by being a single place you can look to learn everything, which makes it not useful. So I would suggest making it historic and saying that the website needs to be the way to document kind of the structure of the organization.
All right. Elliot.
Thanks, Pete. I agree with Jeffrey by and large. If I look at the information that's in this document, we have other documents that cover that information far better at this point. Some of it is, in fact, in the TAO of the IETF. Some of it is in other RFCs, and some of it's on the website and other places. I think probably somebody just if somebody wants to, they would just go and maybe work with somebody like Greg Wood to really identify the right places for this information, on the website, and then we could leave a tombstone after that. Would be my suggestion. Thank you.
Thanks, Elliot. DKG, you're up.
Hi there, Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. So I think this conversation is a difficult one to have because people are hearing it as two different things. I think people are hearing this as the IETF needs to be reorganized, and they're also hearing it as we need a better documentation of what the current situation of the IETF is. If we're talking about getting rid of this document because someone wants to write a better description of how the IETF works, then that's one project. But if we're talking about revising this document in the sense of let's normalize and regularize our organizational chart, that is an entirely different project. And so I think we need to be really clear, if we're asking for a better documentation of what is going on in the IETF, that is the living document project that I think other folks are saying doesn't fit well with the static nature of the RFC. And then the tombstone is totally adequate to just say, we realize that our organization doesn't work in this static way, and you can find better documentation in the following places. And I think a tombstone would be sufficient.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I hadn't heard, other than in the chat room, people questioning it, the suggestion that whatever comes next is somehow going to regularize or do new stuff, but more by way of documenting existing practice.
I think that these things are pretty tightly entangled, right? I mean, when you start asking questions about who is really responsible for a thing, whoever writes that document is going to find themselves coming up against this person is nominally supposed to do it, but in practice, you actually bring it over to this group and they know how to turn the machinery correctly. So I think it's going to be I think they're going to be more closely entangled than we'd like them to be. And that's why people are responding with
fair enough.
fear about this.
I hear that. Thank you. That helped. Colin, you're up to bat.
So, my audio is not working, or is it working?
Yeah, your audio is working. There was a little echo there for a second, but it sounds okay now.
I just got a message from Michiko that wasn't working. So, I agree with a lot of what TKG is saying there. And this is largely, I view this more like a constitutional sort of fine detail document that nails down the exact details of our process. And yes, it's totally embarrassing that it's wrong. But this is not, should not try and revise this to be the thing that helps newcomers or other organizations figure out how work actually happens at IETF. We need stuff that does that, but it doesn't need to be a document like this in the slightest. So I think those are two very completely separate problems. But on this document, updating it, yeah, it's embarrassing how wrong it is, but it seems colossally difficult to get agreement on all the stuff that updates it. So I'm a little bit on the version of, you can troll through the updates for other documents that have updated this one, obsoleted and whatever, and figure out what's going on. I'm not totally sure we should, unless somebody has a huge amount of energy to put into dealing with the use case of fixing the sort of constitution of this stuff, not fixing the educational documentation of what people use. This sounds like it's just going to be a huge quagmire. So I would want us to be really clear on what the scope of changes were we were making before we open this up, or what we were going to do. And I'll remind people that dispatch, one of the ways to dispatch an idea was always to stuff a sword through it, right? That's one of the meanings of dispatch.
Yes. Well, and in this particular case, I believe John's choice number one is the equivalent of, no, we're not going to do anything about this. So thanks. Colin.
Hi, I should know better not to join the queue immediately after Colin, because I'm always confused about who you're calling on. I sort of read this document, and I have to admit that I first started coming to the IETF about a month after this was published, and I haven't read it in the intervening time. And to be honest, from reading it, it doesn't say anything which isn't already on the website. And making sure we have crisp definitions of the charters of the IAB and the IASG and the IETF and all these other organizations, I think is important. This particular document just seems to be describing stuff which is, we already describe it well enough on the website. Just label it as historic and move on.
Did you put yourself in the queue, John? Mr. Clenson?
Yeah,
Did
I
you
didn't
intend to put yourself in the queue?
yell out. I want to slightly push back on some of the comments that have been made recently, including in Jabber. Newcomers do look at this because the website turns out to be very pretty but impenetrable, and maybe we should fix that. Other standards bodies look at this either because we've pointed them to it, or because they want one thing to look at, or because the website is impenetrable and the tau is too long for them to pay any attention to. And with regard to living documents, I understand the argument. I appreciate the argument, but if our organizational structure at the level that this document is talking about, or ought to be talking about, is evolving in real time, then we have another set of problems. And again, if one of the concerns we have, again, referring to some of the comments in the chat, is that other standards bodies look at this and other things and want to prove that we're just a bunch of amateurs and children who shouldn't be, to whom no attention should be paid, then the state of this and saying, go read the Tao or go read these 6 things is not helpful. So I think there's really a strong argument for a document like this. There's a strong argument for a document like this being more than stable enough to keep in the RFC series, even though that doesn't necessarily mean it should be in the RFC series. So let's try to calibrate this relative to newcomers, external impressions, people trying to learn what's going on. One could get rid of it and replace it by crisp references to where to look. But again, that's not really a satisfactory solution, although it might be a good intermediate stage. Thanks.
Thank you. Ecker.
Yeah, I mean, so it seems to me like, having to read this document, like, if the task at hand is, there are 2 tasks at hand. One is to provide, like, what do you need to be a newcomer and, like, be successful at IETF? And, like, a document shaped like this is, like, whether it's in an RFC or whatever, is, like, fantastically not helpful for that. Because, like, there's, like, what you need is a sort of kind of task orientation that this does not bring to the party. If you're looking for a description of, like, the IETF's overall thing, overall structure, well, I guess I'm not sure quite what that's used for, but that's not probably the thing newcomers really need. And while I agree our organization, as sort of Colin pointed out, there's this question of, like, the sort of constitutional stuff and, like, documenting things in a precise format, and there's a question of, like, what you need to know when you're first, like, trying to get into it. And I think I made the example in the chat, like, if you wanted to, like, understand TLS, you wouldn't go to 8446. You'd, like, want to have a document that described, like, how TLS work at a high level, and then you dig into 8446 for the details. So while I understand that our process is going to be changing that rapidly, and so one might imagine, like, that whatever document you produce to explain them does not need to like change also. I don't think that's correct, because as we iterate through like people coming in and people trying to understand what's going on, it will be helpful to be able to revise the documents easily in order to make them clearer as we understand what people find confusing and people not. And the sort of like RFC format is not particularly well suited for that. So while our structures may be stable, the documentation in this case for newcomers ought not to be stable necessarily. And like this is like what the web is good for. So so to close like that relatively long comment, I'm on Tombstone this and put it on the website.
Okay. Keith, you're back in the queue.
A little bit has been mentioned about this in the chat room, but I think that separate from any efforts to document the structure of IETF, we have gotten to be very complex and bureaucratic, and I wonder if that really serves us. And that's an even bigger thing to contemplate than documenting what's there. But I do think it serves as a barrier to participation. And I feel like we're dealing with a structure that we developed in the late 1990s and have since embellished since then, that for an organization which was actually much larger at the time, and I'm not sure that it serves us well for the current somewhat leaner organization or for the organization we have and the current needs we have. So I guess I would like to see some effort at looking at, do we need all these separate organizations? Can we streamline this a bit? But it needs to be done very patiently, of course. So anyway.
Thanks. Cullen, you're back in the queue? No, Cullen didn't want to be in the queue. Harold, please go ahead.
So the document has no real problems. It documents perfectly well what we wanted to say about the situation 25 years ago. The pointers to the document are a problem, because the pointers imply that the state of art that we tried to tell other people 25 years ago is the current state. So I think we should make it historic, because it is. I think we should go hunt for pointers to it and destroy them. Point them to the Tao. I mean, if we have a Tao that is unreadable, then we have a Tao problem. So, middle alternative for me, dispatch it to go historic and get those pointers fixed. I'm a simple man.
Never has anybody claimed that. Andrew, you're back up.
Thanks. Well, sort of reading some of the comments in the chat, if I was being unkind, I'd characterize them as saying, John's pointed out that we're running a restaurant with dirty cutlery, and a few people are suggesting we should just ignore the problem. I think having dirty cutlery is not a good look for a restaurant, and that needs to be fixed. So you can either make it historic, which I personally think, well, or revise it, but ignoring it seems unhelpful. May get closed down when the food inspectors come round. So I think that's asking for trouble. Not changing it because the website, the Tao, and assorted other documents that people might think of are equally wrong, out of date, impenetrable, and nobody uses them anyway, also seems like a really bad argument to me. Yeah, that just talks to the fact that there's a whole bunch of things that need to be fixed, but you've got to start somewhere. And finally, sorry, just laughing at Elliot's comment in the chat. Finally, dare I say it, this does link with the next topic on the agenda, because diversity doesn't improve if you've got enormous barriers to entry to an organization. I think this is just one of those barriers to entry. So putting up with barriers to entry is a bad approach as well. So in my view, something has to be done. Ignoring it is not the answer. Thank you.
Okay, Wes, you're the last one in the queue.
Yeah, so interesting problem. Thanks for finding it. My view is probably slightly different. I'm not sure that historic is right because I don't generally think that we should remove important information, although the historic still exists, so maybe that's not actually the case. I actually think we ought to update it, not to make any changes, no modifications whatsoever, just only clarifications to what the existing state is, right? What are the things that are wrong? Document that, reword it, throw out anything that is no longer relevant, and throw out anything or mark as no consensus where we have disagreement about what the current state is. I think one of the rat holes will be, one person says this and the other person says this about, I don't know how the IAB works, or pick any random one of the organizations that are in that document, and just document as no consensus at this time. With respect to a living document, I don't think that the state of the leadership bodies and all of the organizations change super quickly. We should make RFCs easier to update. I think everybody probably agrees on that. I don't know that it needs to go to the state of a living document, but I would argue that a rewrite, as long as you promise not to make modifications and structural changes, shouldn't be as hard as everybody is saying, if we agree to do that. That's the tricky part.
All right. And Alexei jumped in at the last moment. Alexei.
Yeah, I think I pretty much want to second what Wes just said. Maybe it's a wishful thinking or hearing, but I think maybe we should decide that we want to do something, and then we can figure out whether it's a web page on the website, maybe post a draft, and then see if we want to progress to RFC to replace it, or whether it just becomes a web page on the website. And when people talk about tombstone, I'm not entirely sure. Is this a short RFC saying that the original RFC is obsolete and here's where you want to find the information? And again, it's one of possible outcomes for this.
All right. Heaven help me, I might actually want to use the little polling tool, because I'm trying. I'll turn my video back on. I'm trying to get a sense of how many folks think that going through any of these processes to redocument in some way, whether it's another web page, part of the DAO, a new RFC, whether those folks are outnumbered by the let's just kill it in some way, either by ignoring it or making it historic and moving on. What those numbers are looking like.
I think we should have three show hands for the three possible the list here, and state it so that would you be okay with the first option? Would you be okay with the second one? So you're very welcome to say I'm okay with the first, but absolutely not the second and third, or I'm okay with the first or the second and third. That might give us a better idea of Bron.
That continue to ignore the problem. I'm realizing that continue to ignore the problem is one of the offered options, because that would certainly need to be one of the things that people say whether they're okay with or not.
Yeah,
right.
That is one of the options. Yes.
John.
Yeah, I've realized in the process of this discussion that that my bullet 2 is really two different things. There's maybe two different questions. One of those is to publish a document somewhere which says that's obsolete, hold your nose, go look elsewhere. And the other is to publish a document which says that's obsolete, and these are the specific places to look for these other things. And that was one of the things that came up, at least in Jabber, and is clearly an option here. I have problems with it because telling people to look at a list of things becomes a different kind of barrier to entry, coming back to some other comments you made earlier. but I think that's really two separate options.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of why, and I'm happy to split it up, but the first thing I want to get a sense of, and maybe we'll ask these questions sequentially, and have a little discussion between if we need to. First thing I want to get a sense of is how many people really want to leave things exactly the way they are. How many people want to make this document historic or otherwise say this is obsolete and go no further. And with those two answers, I think maybe we'll have a little better. So, okay, I'm going to take my hand at the tool here. Everybody hang on tight. I think it's best to not do anything. I'm going to start this up. If you raise your hand, that means I think it's best to not do anything. If you actually click do not raise hand, that means no, I don't think that. And if you ignore it, you're just abstaining. So yeah, Ecker, go ahead while we're chugging along.
Could you just please list out what all the options you're going to have are before?
So the next one is going to be. Yeah. The next one is going to be, because I wanted to hold off on the later two, but the next one is going to be I want to obsolete the document in some way, and pause there, and then ask separately questions regarding what to do after we obsolete it, if that's the case. So this one came out, or is coming out pretty much the way I thought it was going to come out, which is just a few people really think it's okay to just say meh. As far as I know, you can't choose more than one thing. Yeah, and Stephen explicitly says in Jabber, meh. All right. Well, that's 4. Okay. Okay. So I'll end that, and now this one is I want to at least mark this document as obsolete or historic. If that is a sufficient way to put it, anybody object to me putting it that way? Okay. So here goes number 2. Please say what you want to say about that one. Good. Okay. So my guesses as to where the room were are looking pretty confirmed on this one. People at least want to mark the document as historic, just, in general. Give it a little bit more time. Anybody else want to? Yeah, good. Okay. So yeah, the general sense of the room is doing absolutely nothing. There's a few people who think that's a good idea, but for the most part, people want to at least mark the document as historic. Okay, so we'll that seems like a good start. So now, this is all. The next two are going to go on the assumption that we mark the document as obsolete or historic. The two choices are going to be, and we're going to do these sequentially, I want to replace it with a new RFC. And the other choice is I want to replace it with a new web page. And I'll give you a third choice. I want to replace it with some pointers to other web pages or information.
Pete, can we vote for more than one of these?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm trying to get a sense of where the room is. Stephen, go ahead.
So Pete, I think you didn't have the option there is to just stop and do nothing else other than mark it as historic.
Oh, right. Sorry. Yes. No, I meant to. Yes. You're absolutely right. So yes, that will also be. Cullen, did you want to follow up there?
I was going to say the same thing as Stephen. So basically, I think the same thing. Also, the web page stuff, like, I mean, I think completely nothing to do with this document. We need to improve our web pages for newcomers and whatever. That's like a no-brainer. But that's I don't want to. I think it's bad to confuse those.
Well, right. So, when I say I want there to be a new web page, I'm asking whether people think that we should have a focused web page on the organization, and same thing with new RFC, and then the choice of
So
I prefer.
phrasing as
Yeah, go ahead.
a new web page that replaces that provides the information content this document was trying to provide.
Right.
Is that
that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
Yep. Wes and then Elliot.
When you say replace with the new RFC or a new web page, you don't discuss what the content of that will be. Again, going back to what I was saying earlier, are we going to just first document? Because otherwise you get into the question of, hey, I'm raising
right. In both of these cases, the question I'm asking is just document existing practice if we can, with understanding that DKG's comment that's inevitably fraught with, is this really the current thing, or are we pushing for adding structure where there really isn't some right now? Elliot, go ahead.
Yeah, Pete, thanks. My confusion is that, as I think Alyssa pointed out, and others, a lot of this information already exists on the IETF webpage. So which option do I choose if I just want to augment whatever's missing?
Yeah, I think, I'll just call. I like that framing of it, because that could be, either some additions to the current web page or some web page that has better pointers. So I'm scribbling down for myself. So nothing beyond obsoleting. Augment current web pages. New web page, or new RFC. Alyssa, go ahead.
So we had this experience when we converted from the previous version of the IETF website to the current version, which is that there's like a lot of cruft, and the team that did that, I think, felt compelled to like exactly reproduce what was on the previous set of web pages in the the current CMS, which is a very painful process. And was something that I took away from that, which is this sort of like design of information in a collection of web pages by a large group is not a great strategy. It doesn't yield really what you would want it to yield. So if there can be sort of a generic option about ensuring that some set of information is available on the website or something like that, that might be good. Getting into like really granular different choices about whether it's just augmentations or new pages or new sections of pages or whatever, like it's very constraining for the people who actually have to like try to make the website usable.
Right. Fair enough. Eve, sorry, go ahead. Eve, you have to unmute yourself. I can't do it.
I'm so used to being co-chair and just having the mic open. Sorry. Anyway, I don't know if this has been discussed before, but it seems to me like part of what we're getting at is that there's this new class of document that when we have our RFPs and they get rewritten or updated, there's a trail around what obsoletes other things, when in fact what we're hinting towards or marching towards seems to be a living document? And has there been discussion about what these obsoleted documents point to is a living document on the web somewhere, hosted on the IETF website?
We did something like that with the DAO, right? Is we decided publishing this as an RFC has all sorts of problems, and we tombstoned it and pointed to a website that ostensibly is supposed to get updated more frequently and be a little more live. Plus or minus, that's true.
So was that considered something we have to do more regularly? And should that be a new category of thing that we create as part of our RFC series?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, that's sort of what I'm putting into the category of make a new web page. But I hear Alyssa's concern that maybe we'll whittle this down to something needs to be done to keep things up to date on the web, and then if people are sort of leaning in that direction, if that's the direction we're going, maybe we'll figure out what it is people mean by that. So let me at least start asking the easier questions. So I'm first going to ask I want to do nothing beyond obsoleting or making historic, and seeing if there's a lot of support for that. So go ahead and raise or don't raise your hand to that one. That's more interesting than the other ones.
Also, we have Rudiger in the queue.
Oh, sorry, Rudiger. While we're doing this, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, so not sure I'm heard.
Yeah, we can hear you.
No, does not look like I'm.
It appears that we can hear you, but you can't hear us. Rudiger is going to go and try to figure out what his tool is doing. So we'll get back to him. Yes, we hear you.
I think there was mention of a couple of pointers to the obsolete document. Pointers out of the RFCs, and if there are any such that are actually significant, like being used in other BCPs, I think those need to be identified, and kind of the dangling links, dangling pointers need to be satisfied in some way.
Yeah.
At the bare minimum, at least the potentially dangling pointers need to be identified.
Good point. No, I appreciate that. Thanks. All right. Well, so that particular one, yeah, the people in the minority are certainly more than rough, as we might say.
So let's read it out for the minutes, maybe. So we have 10 people who raised hand and 25 who did not raise a hand, on a total of 58 participants for I want to do nothing beyond obsoleting or marking historic.
So now I'm going to put I want a new replacement RFC documenting existing practice with all of its caveats. So that is now up. Feel free to poke at that one. Well, now that's amusing. and one person who's flipping back and forth. That was very funny. Thank you. I believe that is the quintessential there ain't no consensus. So for I want a new replacement RFC documenting existing practice, it is 17 people click the raise hand button and 19 people click the don't raise hand button out of 58. I kind of like that. Elliot, you had a comment?
Pete, it seems to me that if this is how 17 people feel, then there should be at least some of those 17 people who are willing to do some writing. And if they're willing to do some writing, then we have something to talk about. Otherwise, we don't in that context.
Well, sure. Although I will say that I take a good portion of those 19 people who click the do not raise hand button as explicitly not wanting there to be a new RFC to replace this one. And
yes,
so...
But what I'm getting at, Pete, is it's one thing to abstractly say, I don't want a new RFC, but if somebody's going to write it, then I think people might actually read it, and then they may have a different point of view.
It's possible.
So we
Let
got
me ask
a couple
of
volunteers. We got Rich. We got maybe Alexei in the chat. It's worth asking if anybody else would be willing to help with this effort.
And then the last question I want to ask is, and I'm going to ask it the general way that Alyssa sort of did, is I want web pages updated to, what do I want to say, properly include the current state of this information. Boy, that's obnoxiously long. People okay with me asking that? No one's whining loudly. There you go. Have something to poke at. I want web pages updated to, well, I didn't even get the D in updated.
Also, we are time check.
Sorry, yeah, we will, and I,
yeah. The chairs are aware.
Yes.
And John, go ahead in the meantime.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that one could want to update the web pages and still believe that having an RFC is a good idea.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we did not limit people to one choice.
Yeah, and to a certain extent, the amount of work needed overlaps very heavily. Getting back to Elliot's point.
Yeah, I took a lot of the do not raise hand on the RFC thing as people actually indicating. I think doing it on the web is fine, but doing it in RFC is not. So, okay, and we've got 26-2 out of the 58 on that question. I think that's enough information to bring back to the list and get a dispatch out of this of some form or another. And people, I mean, Elliot's point is well taken. We can sort of re-ask of people. Would doing an RFC be okay if someone else was going to write it, not me, and find out how that goes. But this is at least sufficient information to bring back to the list and get some feedback on to dispatch this. But I at least smell where this is going, I think. Anything else on this, John? Go ahead.
Yeah, another observation along those lines in terms of what to write up. Which I, at least, if we're going to do this by web page, would like to see the same degree of community consensus about what that web page says as we would expect from an RFC. So let's not pretend that the web page is easier in that regard, even though it might be easier in other respects.
Sure. Ecker? And Ecker will
Yeah,
be
well-
last, and then we'll get to our next go around here.
Yeah. So actually, I think I disagree with what John said. I think that like one of the key elements of a web page is not have to have the same degree of community consensus, and it can be just largely written, and then we can take feedback and and revise it as we go. But the part of what makes our documents inaccessible is the fact that they have to be workshopped so that everybody loves them in exactly the same way, and everybody gets their piece in. And that would not be helpful in this instance.
Then we're at risk of ending up either with Ecker's opinion or my opinion about what it is the organizational structure is, and that's different from an IETF statement of what the organizational structure is. Doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but it's a danger.
I think we need to cut the discussion here. We have, thank you.
Okay. Good. Well, thank you all. That was useful, and I think we have good stuff to bring back to the list. Thank who is? I'm sorry. Who was doing the minute taking here?
Michael and Kirsty.
And Kirsty. Yes, who are taking close to seconds, not minutes, but very helpful nonetheless. All right, Fernando, Keith, you are up to bat. And you have
Can you hear me?
pretty much the rest of the session. Yes, just fine. Go ahead.
Okay. So I'm Fernando Gont, and I will be presenting the document on diversity and inclusiveness in the IETF. It's a document that we co-author with Keith Moore. And this document arises as a result of the discussions that we have had on the GenDispatch mailing list while chartering the term working group. Okay, so next slide. Okay, I think that one of the things that became clear while we were discussing this topic of diversity and inclusiveness is that to a large extent different people were referring to or were implying different things when they were talking about diversity and inclusion. So in order to frame the discussion in an appropriate way, let's clarify what we mean by each of these things. So the first of the terms is diversity, which essentially throughout the document we use to imply as showing a great deal of variety, like different things. So we look at the organization, the IETF, we look at IETF leadership, and we expect to see variety, okay? Then there is a different term which is related to diversity but implies different things, which is inclusion, which essentially talks about a culture and an environment where everyone has equal chances to participate. So this means that inclusion has to do with providing an environment that essentially fosters diversity, okay? Throughout our document, for the most part, what we try to work on is on inclusion and have diversity as a side effect of that inclusion, okay? So what do we mean by variety, which I referred to before, and this is something that also was discussed on the mailing list. We essentially mean every possible aspect that you can think of, like a range of different social and ethnic backgrounds, different genders, different sexual orientations, different countries and regions, different types of organizations, companies, non-profits, etc. This is just a sample of some of the things that we mean by variety, but this list is non-exhaustive and is in no particular order, okay? So this means that when we talk about diversity, we want variety or diversity in each of these different aspects and categories, if you wish. Next slide. Okay, so what we try to do in our document, which you can think of as a problem statement document, is to try to analyze different aspects that essentially are structural issues that make the IETF not as inclusive as we might wish, okay? So there are several categories that we have identified: perceived return of investment, effects of current participation, diversity in IETF groups and leadership roles, processes, etc., etc. So obviously, we will not discuss the details of this. That's what the ID is there for. The draft is there for. But we will simply skim through some of these things. Next slide. So first one is the perceived return of investment. When obviously participation takes time, efforts, money at times too. For people and organizations that participate in the IETF, they obviously have a motivation for doing so. In the case of organizations, companies, among the possible reasons are that they might benefit from IPRs. They might also benefit, for example, from leading or participating in the standardization effort, which at times can result in an improved time to market, for example. For independent participants, that might be done because they believe in making a difference by improving internet technologies, something that might apply to, of course, to organizations, and also for improving their career opportunities. Now, if you think about these things, this possible return of investment, they can only be realized by a small subset of organizations and individuals. For example, there are organizations that or companies that don't manufacture products. So obviously, they wouldn't be able to leverage from an improved time to market, so to speak. So, I mean, we won't get into the details, but you get the idea of what we are talking about here. Next slide. Second one is the effects of current participation. Okay, so obviously current participation reflects the previous slide that we have seen, and for obvious reasons, the current participation results in a bias in a number of areas. First one is perception of structural issues. Okay. It's obviously harder in a way to perceive or understand, let's say, a problem or a challenge that you are not facing yourself. Current participation obviously has a bias on the face-to-face meeting rotation. Normally, meetings are held in areas where most of the participants come from, so one thing leads to the other. The other thing is that obviously the diversity that we have in IETF groups and leadership reflects the diversity that we have in the community to some extent or another. Okay, and finally, this has an effect on how new work is considered by the IETF. Next slide. So part of that. Part of the lack of diversity or reduced diversity that we have in participation obviously reflects in the diversity in IETF groups and leadership roles, and the effect of that is that there is a small number of interests, essentially, judging working group consensus, community consensus, all appeals in the case that there are appeals. Something similar happens for the case of the NOMCOM and the AIB. Similar stuff, and in some cases you may also have arbitrary decisions that are produced and enforced by such groups without a lot of community consensus on them. Next slide. Other things, processes. There are some of our processes that are kind of like loosely specified. And this can be beneficial in some scenarios because it gives freedom, for example, to working group chairs regarding to how to handle processes. But in other cases, it can be problematic for participants because, for example, they don't know what to expect. Like the expectations, don't necessarily match, what actually happens, in our processes. One example of this, for example, is ongoing work on working group adoption of documents, which tries to improve in that aspect. Next slide. Another one is the difficulty in joining or participating in the IETF. Well, first of all, finding interesting groups and areas. There are so many of them that at times, particularly for a newcomer, it may be challenging to identify what's the working group where they might be able to contribute, which working group they should take a proposal if they have any, and so on. There are also challenges that involve authoring and submitting internet drafts. These, of course, has to do, among other things, with the requirements that internet drafts have to comply with per se. Which nowadays, I guess, for most of us, if you need to produce an internet draft, there's not, you need to rely on some of the tools to do that because of the number of requirements. That may be a challenge particularly for newcomers. There are also, for example, in the case of XML to RFC, there are different versions. For example, you might be able to handle version 2 kind of like quite well, maybe not so much version 3, etc., etc. And when it comes to discussion, there are also challenges there. There are people that find the discussions on the mailing lists kind of like challenging, from having to subscribe to specific mailing lists, long threads, etc., etc., etc. And for some of them, the use of GitHub by working groups, can be a great improvement. Whereas on the other hand, there might be people that might be used to using the mailing list, but might not be that familiar with GitHub. So for that other community, GitHub might represent a challenge. And obviously, the decision on on what to use and the extent to which these things are used, represents a trade-off necessarily. Next one. So another one is economic constraints. Obviously the process, well, not right now because of the pandemic, but normal times or pre-pandemic times, the processes obviously favor people that can attend face-to-face meetings. There are a lot of expenses associated with with attending meetings, travel, accommodation, dinners, breakfast, lunches, and so on. Most of them, in a way, we don't control. And there's also the, the issue of meeting fees, which, is something that is, more under our control. In this respect, I do believe that, this document in the SHMU working group is a really, really good thing and is a step in the right direction. Obviously, it doesn't and it can't address some of the other expenses, which are impossible to address by the IETF, but I do think that it helps a lot in that area. Next slide. There are also educational constraints. Normally, in order to become involved in the IETF, you need to have at least some knowledge of a lot of different topics. A little bit about internet protocols, a little bit about transport protocols, congestion control, DNS, etc., etc. That may be a challenge for many people. We are talking about newcomers in particular, right? Like, people that would like to join and participate. And at times, there is, another related issue, if you wish, is that, normally if you want to work on improving, protocols, you not only need to have knowledge about the protocol itself, but, you also need to be able to do some critical thinking, such as, not just taking the technology for granted and assume that that's the best way to do things, but understand the pros and cons, and also understand that, in many cases, what you have in protocols are essentially historical artifacts that probably if we were to redo some things, we wouldn't do them in the same way. So that's important for, if you want to contribute. And the other one is real world experience, like, for example, operational experience. Next slide. I think this is the final one when it comes to the different aspects of areas. It has to do with cultural issues. First one is language. Like, for example, the recent discussion on the GenDispatch mailing list was about inclusive terminology. But language itself, can be challenging in many different ways. Like I would probably argue that for a large number of us, we speak English as a second language, and that can be a challenge. At times, people that speak English as a native language might use, let's say, expressions or jokes that for a non-native English speaker, might have no meaning or might be difficult to comprehend. At times during presentations, this can also be a challenge. For those that speak English as a second language. Using email effectively might also be a challenge. Long threads. The way in which we, technical community employs email. No HTML email. We quote parts of the the email that we want to respond and so on. And there are also issues that are associated with the comfort zone. They may be related with culture itself. In some cultures, at times the kind of discussions that we may have in the IETF might not be, let's say, culturally acceptable for them. There are other issues, like there might be people working in certain fields that, the fact that they occupy a certain role or certain position in the company means that, they don't get involved into certain kinds of discussions, whereas, in the IETF, essentially you are supposed to be willing to, to debate your ideas, proposals, and so on. Next slide. So before actually, the discussing the slide and the moving forward thing, let me just mention that, while talking to the chairs, we agreed to essentially split the presentation in two parts. The first part, the problem statement, which is what we have here, and the second part, to have some proposals for some of the topics that we have discussed. So we could now, focus and discuss, what could be a good next step for this problem statement. And, once we make a decision on that, then we can discuss the, some of the proposals that we have for, for addressing some of these issues. Among the possible options, I guess, is an AD sponsored document. The other possible option would be the creation of a new working group to work on the problem statement and possible solutions. But this is, of course, for the working group to discuss.
Yeah, and I think a subcategory of new working group is, well, not quite sure given what you've said. This could use a BOF, a full BOF devoted completely to this topic to sort of sort out whether this is worth a working group or not. So should we have a little discussion here on the moving forward piece? Is that the plan?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the two parts are separate. Like, we have some proposals for some things, but first of all, I think the most important thing is to agree on the problem.
Yep. All right. So do people want to talk about the directions forward, whether this sounds like a way to go forward? Keith, did you want to just jump in since you're co-author here? Go right ahead.
Sure. So if we're really going to try to improve diversity and inclusion in IETF, it's a very broad topic, and any kind of remedies would, it's the sort of thing that you would address differently in different parts of the organization or in affiliated organizations. And so it seems like a lot for any single working group, and it's especially because some things could be tools, some things could be structural changes, some things could be better documentation. It's possible to imagine some sort of ongoing organization, probably not a working group, that is tasked with keeping track of how well we're doing in this and maybe making recommendations or maybe whatever. There are existing efforts and maybe some efforts that have existed in the past that didn't go as far as we would like. I do believe that diversity and inclusion basically require a commitment to continuous improvement. It's not the sort of thing that... Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say that we probably don't need to necessarily get caught up in titles because, of course, we've had sort of long view working groups that last forever, like this one, for instance, which sort of either do dispatching or say this really needs to be handled in this way. So whether the structure we use happens to be a working group, I think what's important is laying out what we want that whatever that entity is to do. So it doesn't necessarily have to look like a traditional working group with particular milestones and goals for this document, that document.
And I kind of don't care what it's called, but I do think that sometimes we get in a habit of working that is conditioned by working in so many working groups where the goal is to publish some documents and be done. And I kind of think if the structure of whatever this ends up being doesn't encourage that habit, maybe we're better off. But it's I think it's a topic to be sort of discussed among leadership, because clearly I don't think we're going to be able to figure this out. It requires a lot of sensitivity to different parts of the organization. So anyway, exactly what it looks like, I don't know. I'd like to see some sort of effort.
Appreciate it, and stick. And go ahead and feel free to leave yourself either unmuted or on the screen as we go through this, and same with Fernando. So Andrew, you were next in the queue.
Yeah. So on, given that there's I think some good recommendations to come, I think this is a helpful presentation. I think it captures and identifies a really important topic. For what it's worth, I think this is far more important than the already potentially challenging topic of how to handle a few problem phrases. I think this is the significant underlying issue that needs action. And I think an important first step is acknowledging that there is a problem of diversity in many forms, perhaps measuring that in some way, and then looking at what actions to take. But I think just at least getting agreement that it's a problem that needs addressing is a pretty decent start. So thank you.
Stephen, go right ahead.
So I don't think this topic is ready to dispatch in the normal sense. I do think it would be great to see work of some sort continue. A BOF sounds initially attractive, but it kind of has a catch-22, doesn't it? Because if you don't do it face-to-face, it's going to be lacking enormously. And if you do it face-to-face, it's going to exclude everybody you want to kind of attract in. So yeah, there is a mailing list, as I pointed out in the chat. It wasn't necessarily intended exactly for this, but it might be usable. Of the topics covered in the draft, personally, I think the economic exclusion is by far the biggest barrier that's significant for what we want to do. If there was some way to tackle that, I'm not convinced there is, but if there was, that could be a subtopic that might produce something tractable somehow, that could produce some improvement. And just to highlight something, or sorry, just to explain something from the chat, when I say that I think time is the biggest barrier, it's the ability to spend the time on the stuff the IETF cares about and not have to work on your day job because you're a bus driver is, I think, the barrier that I mean. It's not the case that I'm not talking about a consultant who's so busy making $1,000 an hour that they can't be arsed. So that's it. So yeah, I think letting this discussion continue is probably the best concrete outcome.
Well, perhaps we need to spin up a mailing list for this topic so that it doesn't conflict with other discussions on GenDispatch.
And Stephen mentioned in the chat that there is a diversity at IETF.org that exists and was last used around 3 years ago.
I can take a look at that. I think it is. I think it's important to understand that diversity and inclusion, or inclusiveness, or whatever word you want to use, are somewhat different things, and it's easy for us to sort of lump them in together. It's actually possible for them to conflict. So I just want to try to tease those apart and be careful about which we're talking about and which we're understanding. You could make IETF more inclusive and the result be that it's less diverse. I don't think that's necessarily a good result. It is possible. So anyway, just try to keep the topics separate in our minds, I think, and just they are somewhat different.
Jeffrey,
Both
go ahead.
desirable.
Yeah, I think we should try to learn from what other standards bodies are doing. For example, the W3C has an inclusion and diversity community group. I think it, at least in the long run, probably this belongs as some persistent body rather than just a mailing list. I don't know if the time for that is right now. I think AD sponsored would be a mistake even for the problem statement, because like we're seeing that lots of people have things to put into it, that kind of one set of authors isn't really sufficient to cover. And I also asked on the Jabber room if perhaps an IAB program is better than a working group, because the scope the scope of things that need to change is potentially bigger than the stuff that a working group tends to tackle.
Elliot, go ahead.
And hi again. First, thanks Keith and Fernando for the work you did on this draft. I really appreciate it. This is a problem that we can't not talk about. We have to engage on it. A couple of observations. First of all, this isn't our first attempt at this, and we've had at least some success here or there. I'm thinking of the work that Kathleen and Suresh did a while back, that they presented in Berlin, and that was a good beginning. And I think it has helped at times. There are a couple of other efforts that I always think about when we talk about this, like the ISOC Fellows effort in terms of bringing people in who might otherwise not be available. And I think of the 1-1-1 star policy that we have in terms of how we meet and how we've been meeting over the last year. And I say this as the person who wrote a draft that is entirely OBE, called Draft Leader, We Gotta Stop Meeting Like This. I'm wondering then if there are multiple paths to dispatch this sort of in parallel. To a point that's been made in the Jabber and elsewhere, how do we know when we've succeeded? Usually involves some amount of collection of data and analysis. We have people who can help us, I think, do that. They need to organize to do that. They should be doing so in a collaborative way with the community. And I wonder if we can dispatch some of this off to Jay in order to ask for his help in terms of finding out what sort of data we can collect that might be useful in figuring out, how deep of a hole we're in, what sort of problems we have, and then what we can do to address them. So as Stephen opined, that he thought most of the problems were economical. Okay, that is definitely one axis. There are others, and the question is who's affected in which dimension and by how much. And so that's one area. And then the second, I think, is I do like the idea of this community finding a place to continue this conversation, to develop the ideas, to develop a problem statement draft, to continue to work on the work that Keith and Fernando continue. So I'd like to see that work continue, even if it's in GenDispatch for further development, but I'm happy if it goes to another list, and that would be fine with me too. But the analysis aspect has to come along with this before we take any action. Thank you.
Thanks, Elliot. Richard, you're up.
Thanks. So I want to plus one what Jeffrey said about learning from what other groups are doing here. I think that following W3's example and starting up some sort of group where we can have these discussions is really important. Probably a good idea here. Obviously, I think this is an important topic to talk about. The reason I got in the queue was that the notion of a problem statement kind of makes me nervous because this is not like a fixed problem. This problem is not fixed for all time. It's not really, it doesn't really make sense as an RFC to me. And I think this is an area where the sort of waterfall style of development that the IETF sometimes falls into, where we do a problem statement and some requirements, then many moons down the road we get to a solution, is really antithetical to solving this problem. Like, I think there's points of urgent action here. We should obviously make sure we understand what we're doing when we do something, but I don't think we need to understand the entire waterfront of problems before we take action on specific things.
I will agree with that. I think the purpose of the quote problem statement isn't to completely define the problem and then we can go off and fix it. It's more like just to give the community a sense of the breadth of the different issues and also a chance to provide input so that we're hearing from lots of different people. Because it's very easy for a couple of authors or a few people to say, oh, these are the problems, and completely ignore other things that other people are experiencing. But I don't want to do a waterfall style thing. This has to be an ongoing effort, and we have to do what we can when we can.
Kirsty, go right ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, so just to say thank you for writing this draft. I know that can't have been the easiest undertaking, so thank you. I just have a kind of philosophical question about to what extent the IETF itself or attendees who currently go can really understand the inclusion issues. So we obviously all feel included to some extent, that we're able to at least attend and turn up. And I don't know if there's a kind of question here about how you could reach maybe people who came like one time and then were like, thanks, but no way, and left because of the inclusion issues they faced. If there's a way to reach out to those people, just really aware that we're going to have this self-selecting bias of like, well, I attend IETF and I have done for a while, and I find the biggest issue is the tool system, and like, okay, but you're already here. So in terms of inclusivity, maybe, you feel included enough that you are still able to participate. So yeah, I think Elliot said that we can kind of opine as to what the main reason we don't have a vast diversity in the IETF is, why people don't feel included, but obviously we're coming at that from our perspective. And yeah, just to kind of set, I guess, a question or like a caution that, we can form an IETF working group to have a good think about why people don't come to IETF, but obviously that's not the best breadth of representation you could get there. So kind of for moving forward, I would just like to see some conscious effort to reach outside of this SDO, maybe look in other SDOs or other technologies, or look at the kind of newcomers that never came back. Thanks.
Yeah, I would really like to find some way of capturing feedback from not only people who attended once and they didn't come back, but people who maybe even didn't get that far. Because, if you manage to attend and participate at all, you've crossed several barriers and probably gained access to resources who could help you move further. But we have no idea about the people who sort of don't even get that far. And I suspect that's a very underserved population.
So I just want to say that we need to cut the queue here after Daniel, so that we can continue the presentation after that. Go ahead, Ecker.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, so some of what other people have said, I think, I think it's good to have a sort of survey document that kind of covers much of the space. These are issues which I think the entire industry is struggling with more or less success in various axes. So I think, it's important here to, when we figure out things that we can do, like find some way to do them. So I definitely be in favor of having some sort of mailing list and use that as a brainstorming, kind of an incubator or a nursery for new ideas. And then when those ideas become ripe for work, as the term work did, then we take them on and actually do them in IETF. So I don't think that we're not going to solve like the entire thing in one shot. So it's certainly I'm in favor of like, having a venue where we can try to like make incremental forward progress.
DKG, go ahead.
Yeah. So I want to thank the authors of the document. This is overdue for the IETF, and I think there's a pretty good initial statement here. I want to point out that the comfort zone point that they raise is actually pretty critical. And the organizations that I've been part of that have tried to do this kind of work have struggled a lot internally. And I can't imagine that the IETF would not also be struggling. This is going to be difficult if we take it seriously. And if we don't take it seriously, it's pretty irresponsible. To do that difficulty, to handle that difficulty, particularly for groups that have already sort of kept out people, which I think includes the IETF, we are going to need to think about bringing in folks from outside the IETF to give us actual critiques, actually listening to them. And the process of doing that is not something that is done for free. If you want to get somebody to come and give you a organizational analysis, you often legitimately need to pay them for their time and their effort. And you're going to be paying them to tell you things that you don't want to hear about yourself. And so we can talk about trying to do this ourselves, and I think we should be trying to do it ourselves, but I don't think we should only be trying to do it by ourselves. And we need to think about how we allocate resources towards addressing these problems. It's not going to be for free, and it's not going to be fun, but it is necessary.
Well, just to summarize, I mean, I'm at least hearing a general sense from folks that this idea of setting up a mailing list, either reusing one that is currently stagnant or creating a new one, there seems to be at least some momentum for that's a good idea, and then figure out what structures to put behind it as we go. So, you know, that seems like at least a positive step. And then I think talking to Lars about what kind of structure to put around it, since he's going to be the stuckee at some level in all likelihood, is probably a good next step as well.
I would say oh, sorry to interrupt. Let me know when
go
you're
ahead.
done. Okay.
No, go right ahead.
I certainly want to see a mailing list discussion, but I think in a way it's easy for those to get buried. And so I think it might be useful to have a mailing list and also some expectation of having additional meetings, just maybe to raise the level of awareness of this, that this effort is going on. And maybe not a long-term commitment to doing that until we know what the structure is, but at least maybe at the next IETF meeting. And again, Lars or the other ADs or whatever can call it whatever they want, but I'd like to see something to raise the level of awareness.
A long, drawn-out BOF. Yeah.
The BOF that never ends.
The BOF that never ends. Okay. We'll go back to that. So Keith, did you want to do some of the solutions-based stuff, and then we can wrap up from there?
Sure. So I would say these are suggestions and brainstorming, and part of the hope, I think, is that it will solicit other input. So if you don't like something here and you want to suggest something alternative, that's awesome. Basically, I would just like to see a lot of different ideas come forth, and some of them may or may not be workable, but don't filter them because you think they're not. Just try to get some input into the process. So next slide, please. Some disclaimers. A lot of these problems are not problems, I think, that can be fixed by publishing RFCs. Again, that's kind of the normal thing that we do, and we might get in a habit of sort of doing that. Documenting something that's done is great, and sometimes you will need an RFC, but sometimes, again, you might need tools. Sometimes you might need organizational changes. Sometimes you might need just to recognize existing efforts and work with those to be sort of to have them dovetail with things. And sometimes you might need to solicit support from elsewhere, like ISOC or anyone else, for instance, that could fund participation for people who can't as easily participate. So lots of different things. Again, as we say, we probably need effort from multiple parts of IETF and related groups. There are some past efforts which I would like to recognize, and if they're still ongoing, maybe encourage them some and sort of build some more cooperation. We will need some new efforts also. As I said earlier, I think we need a commitment to continuous improvement in this area. So this is, it's not we do this once and we're done. It is a change in the attitude of the organization. But I will say that I've always seen in IETF a genuine desire to openness. And I think it still exists. And I think I don't want to say we've been doing it all wrong, we need to completely change things. No, I think we just need to continue and add to what has been done before, and continue this high value of openness, and realize we can do better than we've done, and conditions have changed, and sometimes we need to change too. And the last point about different timescales, some things can be fixed quickly and some things are going to need longer term efforts. So next slide, please. So this is an idea, not the only possible idea, but a way to promote more diversity in IETF groups and leadership roles. Essentially rotating people through working group chairs would train more people. It would make more people available for potentially other leadership roles, and perhaps also a bit more churn within a working group, and maybe an additional chair within each working group would give a wider variety of people recourse if they didn't think things were being handled properly. So just promote a better sense of fairness and inclusion than perhaps we have now. Next slide. The suggestion also is you don't want, in general, if the sort of appeals chain or process chain of a document or a working group involves several people from the same organization, that could be a barrier if there are efforts that a certain company doesn't see as in their interest and wishes to discourage. So we'd like to see perhaps more diversity of the sponsors of different working group chairs, and some rotation of this. Next slide. Again, for IESG, it would be nice if perhaps there was, and this would affect NomCom, but that basically you shouldn't have more than one IESG or more than one person from the same organization on IESG at the same time. And this would probably have to be sort of gradually phased in rather than we're going to kick some people out. But again, just less opportunity for any single company to stack the deck, so to speak. And the last bullet here, again, if a working group is under a particular AD, then they should be from different companies. Next slide. Similar idea for IAB members. And I guess a gap between moving from one role to another, so that maybe there's just more churn. Next slide. This comes from, I think, Fernando's experience in NomCom, where there was a strong assumption that NomCom members needed to show up for face-to-face meetings. And there was even a suggestion that I think he stepped down because he had a hard time doing this. So I think it's a fair point that the rules that we have for selecting NomCom, while they've tried really hard to be fair, they come from a somewhat different era. And it's harder for people to attend all the meetings now in some ways than it was for the participants back at that time. So in some ways, that's because we're more diverse, and that's a good thing. But maybe if NomCom could adapt to relying less on face-to-face contact and more things online. And also the suggestion that NomCom members should recuse themselves from discussion or of a candidate that's from their own organization. I'd like to think that happens already, but maybe that's not the case. Next slide. Fee waiver for face-to-face meetings. Obviously, that's going to require, well, we can understand why that might be difficult, but that certainly the cost of participating in face-to-face meetings is a barrier. And I think anything that if we can find sponsors or ways of providing economic assistance to people who have a hard time attending face-to-face meetings, I think that would be a good thing. And whether that's done by the organization making things cheaper, whether that's done by finding, sponsors or scholarships or something as has been done in the past, I don't know. But I think it does need to be kind of an ongoing thing and not just like, hey, you can attend one meeting, and that's not going to really improve the inclusion and diversity in the organization. So next slide. So, and I guess if we have discussion time, I guess we're kind of running low. Maybe it's better for a mailing list if it's created or something like that. But we were sort of, Fernando and I were kind of unsure about how to proceed because this would be kind of a weird effort. And there was a question about whether we should just sort of have lots of standalone proposals to address different points that have been identified or what. And I don't know. That's just probably a topic for discussion. And that, I believe, is the last slide, or nearly so. Let's see what I have here. Yes. So I'll defer to the chairs, but I think in some ways we'd like to have a sense from the group of proposals for moving forward. More perhaps than brainstorming about solutions at this point, because we're kind of short on time.
Yeah, I think if, again, it was sounding to me earlier, and what you laid out doesn't go against this, is that there is some momentum for let's get a list set up and start talking about it there. I think we do have to talk about structure of moderation, whether someone's going to be the putative chair or some sort to keep discussions going. But do folks want to make any comments on these particular? And like Keith said, it's probably not worth going into, diving into the details of any given proposal, but any comments on this so far? The Jabber Room, by the way, has been quite helpful and interesting as you were talking. Definitely worth going back and taking a look at what some people said.
Right. Sorry, I couldn't follow it while I was talking. But
yeah, no,
I will definitely take a look. Yeah.
Andrew, you wanted to make a comment?
Yeah, it was just maybe picking up on the suggestion, Pete, you made near the start in terms of next steps. Well, firstly, I think the points you covered, both authors, in the paper and so on, were good, and I think a good starting point, a solid foundation. There's maybe a few things I would add extra, but we don't need to discuss those here. I do wonder whether a good next step to put more substance to this, though, could be a BOF. Going back to one of the points that you suggested at the start, Pete, as an next step, which could be arranged, I think, quite quickly, so it needn't delay things, just to maintain some momentum. Because just doing something on a list, I think it would lose a lot if that's all that happened next. So that would be my suggestion.
Right, because a BOF doesn't necessarily. I mean, a BOF doesn't necessarily have to be working group forming. It could be, okay. We're trying to figure out the direction that this stuff is going, and so maybe calling it a BOF is a way to continue momentum.
Yeah.
And it certainly serves the purpose of having a meeting at the next IETF. So yeah.
Yeah. And then, maybe Lars can give us some feedback on different structures we might use or ways to approach this that might work out best. Since anybody else? Well, I think we have some direction here. I think at the very least, we're saying let's get a mailing list set up, and then I think once we get that mailing list set up, let's at least start the conversation by having Lars, who by tomorrow will be our new AD, sort of step in there and say, okay, start the discussion of how we should structure this. I think I'm hearing a good deal of support for going forward with something. but people aren't really sure what that something would look like in the end. Does anybody
Like
disagree with
having a
that assessment?
Sounds like having a venue to continue the discussion, not only a mailing list, but like an actual meeting is a good idea.
Yeah. And yeah, to Alyssa's question, why not use the existing list? I think that's not a problem. I think, and Keith can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the only concern was that had sort of a charter of its own at some point, and we wouldn't want to conflate it with that. But beyond that, if there's an existing list and we want to use that, I think it's perfectly reasonable.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd like to look at the list charter just to refresh my memory of it. Sometimes it is good to start fresh, it's just psychologically speaking, but I don't have a strong opinion about it at this point.
Yeah, Alyssa, go ahead.
The description of what the list is for can be changed. So it's not like it's set in stone, whatever it says there. That's what we did with many couches recently.
All right. Good. Well, we have 5 minutes left, and I wanted to give the floor to Alyssa and/or Lars, our outgoing and incoming ADs, and talk about what we're doing going forward.
Thanks. So first of all, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Francesca for her leadership of this working group. She's, as you all know, moving on to the IESG tomorrow. So she's going to be stepping down, but really appreciate everything you've done. Hasn't always been easy. And, this is kind of an experiment with bringing the dispatch model to the general area. So I'm really thankful for all of your efforts. And Lars, do you want to talk about who we're bringing on?
I can. It'll be pretty quick in the sense that, as you can imagine, the handover procedure, thanks to COVID, hasn't been quite so great as it has been in previous years. So I'm sort of still coming up to date. So for the foreseeable future, the next couple of weeks, maybe until the next meeting, continue as steady as you go. I'll keep a closer eye on what's going on. And I think sort of we're going to have a discussion then with Pete and Kirsty about what we're going to do going forward with some of these larger topics, right? Because it's clear that the dispatch style isn't really suitable for them. But for now, this is what we have. And I think that's where the discussion has been happening and should continue.
And big thanks to Kirsty for being willing to volunteer and take on the role as co-chair.
Welcome, Kirsty.
You're welcome. Thanks.
To both Kirsty and Francesca, congratulations all around. Thank you so much. All right. With that, any other business? Anyone want to jump in quick? 3 minutes of your day could be returned to you immediately. 3, 2, 1. Thank you all. Thank you very much to our note takers. You did a fabulous job.
Yes. Thank you. See you
Good
in
day,
Ghana.
everyone.